You thought you knew what solitude meant until that October morning when the mist hung thick over Pine Ridge Valley and three figures emerged from the fog like ghosts materializing from another world. Jack Morrison had been living in his grandfather's cabin for 8 months, believing he'd finally found peace in the remote wilderness of Montana Territory, far from the chaos of civilization and the memories that haunted him from the war. The cabin sat nestled between towering pines and a crystal-clear stream that sang its way down from the snow-capped peaks above. A perfect sanctuary where a man could forget the sound of gunfire and the screams of dying soldiers. But peace, Jack was about to learn, was nothing more than a temporary illusion in a land where survival depended on more than just hunting skills and a steady aim. The first sign something was wrong came with the smell of coffee brewing when he hadn't lit his stove, followed by the soft sound of feminine laughter drifting through the morning air like music he hadn't heard in years. When he stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand and heart hammering against his ribs, he found them sitting around his fire pit as if they'd been there all along, 3 women dressed in traveling clothes that had seen better days but still carried an elegance that spoke of money and breeding. The eldest appeared to be in her 30s, with auburn hair pinned up in a style more suited to a city parlor than the Montana wilderness. Her green eyes holding secrets that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight like shadows on a wall. She introduced herself as Eleanor Whitmore, speaking with the refined accent of someone educated back east, perhaps Boston or Philadelphia, though there was something in her voice that suggested she'd traveled far beyond the comfortable confines of high society. Beside her sat a woman who couldn't have been more than 25, with golden hair that caught the morning light and blue eyes that seemed to see right through him, introducing herself simply as Catherine with no surname offered and none requested. The third woman remained silent, watching him with dark eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom, her black hair hanging loose around shoulders that carried themselves with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed rather than ignored. She was introduced as Maria, though whether that was her real name or simply convenient remained unclear, and Jack found himself wondering what circumstances had brought 3 such different women together in his remote corner of the world. Eleanor smiled at his obvious confusion and asked that question that would echo in his mind for weeks to come, her voice carrying just enough challenge to make his jaw tighten with something between irritation and curiosity. She wanted to know if he truly believed this cabin belonged only to him, as if the very concept of ownership was nothing more than an amusing notion invented by men who'd never learned to share what the earth provided freely to all who needed shelter from the storms of life. Jack's first instinct was to tell them to move along, that this was his land and his cabin and they had no right to make themselves at home without so much as asking permission. But something in Eleanor's eyes stopped him cold, a look that suggested she knew things about this place that he didn't, secrets that might change everything he thought he understood about his inheritance and his right to call this sanctuary his own. The women had arrived with nothing more than the clothes on their backs and a single leather satchel that Catherine guarded with the devotion most people reserved for their most precious possessions, never letting it out of her sight and flinching whenever anyone came too close to wherever she'd placed it for safekeeping. They claimed to be travelers whose wagon had broken down miles from anywhere, forced to abandon their belongings and walk through the night to find shelter before the mountain cold could claim them. But their story had holes big enough to drive that same wagon through if anyone cared to look closely enough. For one thing, their shoes showed no signs of the kind of wear you'd expect from people who'd walked miles through rough terrain, and their dresses, while dusty and wrinkled, weren't torn or damaged the way they should have been if they'd really spent hours pushing through underbrush and rocky ground in the dark. More importantly, none of them seemed particularly distressed by their supposed ordeal, chatting and laughing as if they were guests at a social gathering rather than desperate refugees seeking help from a stranger. But Jack found himself offering them food and a warm place to rest, telling himself it was simply the decent thing to do and trying to ignore the way Catherine's smile made his pulse quicken or how Eleanor's laugh seemed to fill the empty spaces in his chest that had been hollow since he'd returned from the war to find his world forever changed. The first night passed peacefully enough, with the women sleeping by the fire while Jack kept watch from his bed, rifle close at hand and senses alert for any sign of trouble that might be following his unexpected guests through the wilderness. But morning brought new questions when he woke to find Eleanor already up and moving around his cabin as if she'd lived there for years rather than hours. She knew where he kept his coffee and how he liked his eggs cooked, information she claimed to have gathered through observation and feminine intuition, though Jack couldn't remember being observed closely enough for anyone to learn such intimate details about his daily routines. More disturbing was the way she seemed to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, offering him exactly what he wanted before he knew he wanted it, creating an atmosphere of domestic comfort that felt both wonderful and deeply unsettling. Catherine spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, claiming to be fascinated by the local flora and fauna. But Jack noticed she paid particular attention to the old mine shaft his grandfather had dug into the hillside decades ago, standing at its entrance for long minutes with an expression of intense concentration that suggested she was seeing more than just abandoned tunnels carved into rock and earth. Maria remained largely silent, helping with cooking and cleaning but offering little conversation beyond basic pleasantries. Though Jack caught her studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, her dark eyes evaluating him with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. There was something familiar about her face that nagged at him, a sense that he'd seen her somewhere before, though he couldn't place where or when such a meeting might have occurred. By the third day, Jack was beginning to wonder if his guests had any intention of leaving, though he found himself increasingly reluctant to ask them directly, partly because their company had awakened feelings he'd thought were buried forever alongside his fallen comrades, and partly because something about their presence made the cabin feel more like home than it had since his grandfather's death. Eleanor seemed to read his thoughts with uncanny accuracy, assuring him they would move on soon but needed a few more days to rest and plan their next destination, though she remained vague about where they were headed or what had brought them to Montana territory in the first place. Her evasiveness should have raised more red flags than it did, but Jack found himself trusting her despite his better judgment, drawn in by her warmth and intelligence, and the way she made even mundane conversations feel like fascinating exchanges of ideas and experiences. It was Catherine who provided the first real clue about their true purpose when she accidentally let slip a comment about the cabin's previous owner, referring to Jack's grandfather by name despite never having been told who he was or how Jack had come to inherit the property. When pressed, she claimed to have heard stories about the old prospector from people they'd met on the road, but her explanation felt rehearsed and hollow, lacking the spontaneous details that would have made it believable. That night, Jack pretended to sleep while keeping watch through barely opened eyes, and was rewarded by the sight of his three guests huddled together in intense conversation, their voices too low to make out words but their body language suggesting serious discussion of matters that concerned them all deeply. Catherine clutched her leather satchel throughout the conference, and more than once Jack saw Eleanor gesture toward the mine shaft Catherine had been so interested in exploring. The revelation that changed everything came on the fourth morning when Jack woke to find Maria standing over him with a pistol pointed at his chest, her expression apologetic but determined, while Eleanor and Catherine ransacked his belongings with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for and where they were likely to find it. Eleanor's cultured accent had vanished completely, replaced by the harder tones of someone who'd grown up far from the refined drawing rooms she'd claimed as her background, and she addressed him with a mixture of regret and resolve that made it clear this had always been their intention despite the genuine warmth she'd shown over the past few days. The truth, as Eleanor explained while Catherine continued her search, was that his grandfather hadn't been the simple prospector everyone believed him to be, but rather a man with connections to some very dangerous people who'd trusted him with something valuable enough to kill for and important enough that they'd spent years tracking it down through every lead and rumor that might point them toward its current location. Jack's grandfather had apparently made enemies during his younger days as a scout and guide for wagon trains crossing hostile territory, getting involved in activities that went far beyond simply showing people the safest routes through Indian country and bandit-infested mountain passes. He'd been part of a group that had discovered something in these mountains, something that certain powerful individuals back east were willing to pay handsomely to possess and kill ruthlessly to protect. The leather satchel Catherine had guarded so carefully contained documents that proved his grandfather's involvement in the theft of a fortune in gold and precious stones from a mining operation that had been secretly funding Confederate forces during the war, money that had disappeared along with several key participants when Union forces had finally closed in on their network of supporters and suppliers. Jack's grandfather had been one of only 3 men who knew where that treasure was hidden, and both of his partners had died under suspicious circumstances within months of the war's end, leaving him as the sole keeper of secrets worth more than most people could imagine and dangerous enough that merely knowing them could prove fatal. Eleanor, Catherine, and Maria weren't random travelers at all, but rather agents working for the same Eastern interests that had been hunting his grandfather for years, following a trail of clues that had finally led them to this remote cabin and the man they hoped would provide the final piece of the puzzle they'd been trying to solve. But Jack knew nothing about hidden treasure or his grandfather's wartime activities, had inherited the cabin believing it was simply the retreat of an old man who'd wanted to spend his final years away from civilization and its complications, and his honest confusion seemed to surprise his captors as much as their revelations had shocked him. Catherine's search of the cabin had turned up nothing more incriminating than old letters from distant relatives and a few personal mementos from his grandfather's long life. But Eleanor remained convinced that the secret they sought was hidden somewhere on the property, waiting for someone clever enough to interpret the clues that had been left behind. The mine shaft became their primary focus, with Maria keeping watch over Jack while Eleanor and Catherine explored its depths with lanterns and measuring tools, looking for hidden chambers or concealed passages that might contain the fortune they traveled so far to claim. Their search revealed nothing but empty tunnels and abandoned equipment, yet Eleanor's determination only seemed to grow stronger with each disappointment. Jack found himself caught between admiration for their persistence and growing concern about what they might do if they finally accepted that their quest was hopeless, that whatever secrets his grandfather had taken to his grave were truly lost forever. These were clearly people accustomed to getting what they wanted through whatever means necessary, and their patience wouldn't last indefinitely. The first real hint that their true nature was darker than they'd initially revealed came when Catherine mentioned casually that they'd been responsible for the accidents that had befallen his grandfather's former partners, speaking about murder with the same tone most people used to discuss the weather, as if taking lives was simply another business expense in their line of work. Eleanor seemed to realize that Catherine had said too much, shooting her a warning look that promised consequences for loose tongues. But the damage was done, and Jack now understood exactly what kind of people had invaded his sanctuary and how far they were willing to go to achieve their goals. That knowledge should have terrified him, but instead it awakened something he'd thought the war had killed forever. A cold anger that burned steady and bright in his chest as he realized these women had played on his loneliness and isolation to gain access to his home and his trust. They'd made him care about them, made him hope that maybe he could build a new life with companions who understood something about loss and survival, and all of it had been nothing more than an elaborate deception designed to lower his guard. The first real hint that their true nature was darker than they'd initially revealed came when Catherine mentioned casually that they'd been responsible for the accidents that had befallen his grandfather's former partners, speaking about murder with the same tone most people used to discuss the weather, as if taking lives was simply another business expense in their line of work. Eleanor seemed to realize that Catherine had said too much, shooting her a warning look that promised consequences for loose tongues. But the damage was done, and Jack now understood exactly what kind of people had invaded his sanctuary and how far they were willing to go to achieve their goals. That knowledge should have terrified him, but instead it awakened something he'd thought the war had killed forever. A cold anger that burned steady and bright in his chest as he realized these women had played on his loneliness and isolation to gain access to his home and his trust. They'd made him care about them, made him hope that maybe he could build a new life with companions who understood something about loss and survival, and all of it had been nothing more than an elaborate deception designed to lower his guard. The final revelation came on the seventh night when Jack managed to slip his bonds while Maria dozed at her post, creeping through the darkness to where Eleanor and Catherine were conducting yet another fruitless search of the mine shaft, and overheard enough of their conversation to understand that they had no intention of leaving him alive once they'd found what they came for. But as he listened from the shadows, he also learned something that changed his understanding of everything that had happened since that misty October morning when three strangers had appeared in his clearing like figures from a dream. His grandfather hadn't just hidden a treasure in these mountains. He'd hidden his own daughter, a girl who'd grown up believing herself to be an orphan while her father watched over her from a distance, protecting her from the enemies who would have used her to get to him. Maria was that daughter, raised by the same Eastern interests that now employed her but never knowing her true parentage, trained from childhood to be their weapon while remaining ignorant of the bitter irony that she was hunting her own father's legacy. The documents in Catherine's satchel didn't just prove his grandfather's involvement in wartime theft. They contained evidence of Maria's true identity, information that Eleanor and Catherine planned to use to destroy her emotionally before disposing of her physically once their mission was complete. Jack realized that Maria's earlier silence and watchfulness hadn't been professional evaluation but rather the unconscious recognition of familiar features in his face, the resemblance to a father she'd never known but whose blood called to her through bonds deeper than training or loyalty. She was his cousin, the family he'd never known he had, and she was about to become the victim of the same people who'd already destroyed so many lives in their pursuit of wealth that existed only in legend and speculation. The confrontation that followed tested every skill Jack had learned during his years as a soldier, pitting him against trained killers in terrain he knew better than anyone else alive, using the knowledge his grandfather had passed down about secret passages and hidden rooms that the women had never found despite their thorough searches. The mine shaft did indeed contain treasure, but not the gold and precious stones Eleanor and Catherine had expected to find. Rather, a cache of weapons and supplies his grandfather had hidden for the day when his enemies finally tracked him down. Along with documents that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy they were all caught up in, and the true identities of the people pulling the strings from their comfortable offices back east. Eleanor and Catherine fought with the desperation of people who'd invested too much to accept defeat, but they'd underestimated both Jack's determination to protect his newfound family and Maria's reaction to learning the truth about her parentage and the people who'd shaped her life through lies and manipulation. The battle that raged through the tunnels and across the mountainside ended with Eleanor dead and Catherine fleeing into the wilderness, wounded and alone, carrying nothing but the knowledge that her carefully planned operation had failed completely and catastrophically. Jack and Maria stood together in the dawn light, surrounded by the wreckage of the cabin that had been their battlefield, both of them forever changed by revelations that had rewritten their understanding of their own histories, and the forces that had brought them together in this remote corner of Montana territory. They buried Eleanor beside the stream that sang its way down from the mountains, not because she deserved such a peaceful resting place, but because the earth needed to reclaim what had been taken from it, and because Maria needed to perform some ritual that would help her process the end of the only life she'd ever known. The treasure that had caused so much death and suffering turned out to be less valuable than the family connection Jack and Maria had discovered, though they used what they could to rebuild the cabin and establish themselves as partners in the kind of life his grandfather had always envisioned for this place. Catherine was never seen again, though sometimes on misty mornings they thought they glimpsed a solitary figure watching them from the distant ridgelines, a reminder that some debts can never be fully paid and some enemies never completely defeated. Jack learned to trust again, though more carefully than before, and Maria discovered that family could be chosen as well as inherited, that the bonds forged through shared struggle could be stronger than those created by blood alone. The cabin became what it was always meant to be, a sanctuary where people could heal from the wounds the world had inflicted on them, though now it sheltered two souls instead of one, both of them wiser about the price of solitude and the value of trust earned through fire rather than given freely to beautiful strangers who emerged from the morning mist with questions that changed everything forever. The months that followed brought changes neither Jack nor Maria could have anticipated when they first stood together in the smoking ruins of what had been his grandfather's sanctuary. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Pine Ridge Valley in snow so deep it seemed to muffle even their thoughts, creating a silence so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath while they figured out how to build a life from the ashes of everything they'd believed about themselves and their place in the vast wilderness of Montana territory. Maria proved to have skills that went far beyond the lethal training her handlers had provided, revealing herself to be remarkably gifted at carpentry and construction, her hands seeming to remember techniques she'd never consciously learned, as if her father's blood carried genetic memories of how to shape wood and stone into structures that could withstand whatever nature might throw at them. Together, they rebuilt the cabin larger and stronger than before, adding rooms and improvements that transformed it from a hermit's retreat into a true homestead capable of sheltering multiple families if necessary. Jack discovered that having someone to talk to about the war helped ease burdens he'd carried alone for too long, and Maria found that sharing her own stories of manipulation and betrayal somehow lessened their power to define who she was becoming rather than who she'd been forced to be. They spent long evenings by the fire, filling in the gaps in each other's histories, slowly constructing a shared understanding of the forces that had shaped their separate journeys toward this remote valley where their paths had finally converged in violence and revelation. Spring brought visitors, travelers who'd heard rumors of hospitality available to those willing to work for their keep, and Jack and Maria found themselves becoming the kind of people his grandfather had always hoped would inherit his vision of what this place could become. They took in drifters and dreamers, were veterans struggling with memories that wouldn't heal, families seeking new starts in territory where past mistakes could be forgotten if a person proved willing to put honest effort into building something better. The mine shaft was sealed permanently, its secrets buried along with the violence that had brought them to light, though Jack and Maria kept the weapons cache their grandfather had hidden, understanding better than most that preparedness was the price of peace in a land where civilization remained fragile and threats could emerge from the morning mist without warning or mercy. Catherine never returned, though they occasionally received reports from passing traders about a lone woman matching her description, always traveling alone, always looking over her shoulder, always moving toward some distant destination that seemed to recede before her like a mirage in the desert. Whether she'd found whatever redemption she might have been seeking remained unknown, but her absence became a kind of presence itself, a reminder that some stories end without resolution and some debts follow people to graves that no one bothers to mark. Maria changed her name to Morrison, claiming the family connection that had been stolen from her by people who'd seen her only as a weapon to be aimed at targets they were too cowardly to face themselves. She wore her new identity like armor against the past. Though sometimes Jack caught glimpses of the trained killer, she'd been in the way she moved through shadows or positioned herself to watch all approaches to their growing settlement. The community that grew up around their rebuilt cabin became known throughout the territory as a place where people could find not just shelter and safety, but the chance to discover who they might become when freed from the expectations and limitations others had imposed on them. Jack and Maria never advertised their services or sought recognition for what they'd created, but word spread anyway, carried by grateful visitors who'd found healing in the mountains and wanted others to know such refuge existed. Years passed, marked not by the calendar, but by the cycles of planting and harvest, of births and deaths, of arrivals and departures that defined life in a place where tomorrow was never guaranteed, but hope remained constant. Jack's hair turned gray at the temples, and Maria's face acquired the kind of weathered beauty that came from honest work under open skies. But their partnership deepened rather than diminished, built on foundations stronger than romance or convenience. They never married, finding that the bonds forged in combat and strengthened through shared purpose needed no formal recognition to validate their importance. Though visitors often assumed they were husband and wife, and neither bothered to correct such misconceptions. Their relationship existed outside conventional categories, something unique to their circumstances and personalities, a connection that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for the experience. The treasure that had brought so much death to their doorstep was eventually distributed among the families who'd made the valley their home, used to purchase tools and livestock, to build schools and workshops, to create the kind of prosperity that came from shared effort rather than individual accumulation. Eleanor's dream of sudden wealth had become the reality of gradual abundance, though she'd never lived to see how her greed had inadvertently funded the very thing she tried to destroy. Sometimes, on nights when the wind carried the scent of snow from the high peaks, Jack and Maria would sit together on their porch and remember that misty October morning when three strangers had emerged from the fog with a question that had changed everything. They'd learned that ownership was indeed a more complex concept than either had imagined, that belonging to a place sometimes mattered less than helping that place become worthy of the people who chose to call it home. The cabin still stood where his grandfather had built it, though expanded and improved beyond recognition, surrounded now by other buildings and busy with the sounds of children and conversation, laughter and honest labor. It remained a sanctuary, but no longer for solitude, instead offering the kind of peace that came from community and purpose, from knowing that some things were worth fighting for and others worth building toward. Jack Morrison had thought he knew what he wanted from life when he'd first retreated to this remote valley, seeking nothing more than escape from memories that wouldn't fade and a world that seemed determined to disappoint him at every turn. He'd discovered instead that healing came not from hiding but from connection, not from forgetting but from finding meaning in the struggle to create something better than what had come before. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn when mist still hung thick over Pine Ridge Valley, he could almost hear his grandfather's voice carried on the mountain wind, expressing approval for what the sanctuary had become and satisfaction that the secrets he'd protected had finally been transformed into the kind of legacy worth leaving for future generations to inherit and improve upon. The question Eleanor had asked that first morning continued to echo through the years, though its answer had evolved beyond simple concepts of ownership into something richer and more complex, an understanding that true belonging came not from claiming territory but from becoming worthy of the trust that territory placed in those who chose to call it home.